Okay, thank you. Final question from me, Cabinet Secretary. Is there a risk? Can you take your government hat on and go back to the days when you were just a member of this committee, although in the governing party at the time, and look at this regulation that's being put forward today? Do you accept that some could have concerns that if we agree this today, we give the government a get-out clause from the vote on the 10th of September last year, when this Parliament defeated the SNP government to enact a policy of universal free school meals to P1s to 7? That was a vote that Parliament agreed on, 64 to 60 with 2 abstentions. Yeah. And it was very clear that despite the government and yourself lodging an amendment that it was still your aspiration to deliver free school meals, but you didn't have the funding to do so, you were defeated. And therefore the will of Parliament is still today for universal free school meals for all primary pupils. By agreeing this regulation today, according to your own policy note, we are increasing the eligibility for free school meals, but which are not as expansive as universal provision. By including that line in your own policy note, are you not giving yourself a get-out clause to say we can now ignore the will of Parliament from the 10th of September last year because Parliament will potentially agree your regulation today?
So I wouldn't accept that, Convener. I don't think you'll be surprised to hear that. But look, the government's aspiration remains the delivery of universality in our primary schools. That is a commitment I stand by. You will have heard extensively the debate we had, of course, last year, but also in exchanges in the Parliament, the unaffordability of us being able to deliver that in this parliamentary term. And that was predicated, the data I think from that debate was informed by SFT analysis, which suggested that universality would cost in the region of £256 million. And as officials have reminded me this morning, that figure is actually now 2 years out of date, so we could expect that to be far in excess of £256 million. What we have committed to through the budget and also through budget negotiations is a broader expansion that's focused on SCP. And actually, if anything, I would argue that this commits us to that and going more quickly than we would do otherwise, because, of course, we give the example.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I see you shaking your head.
Yeah, well, very much so, because page 1 of your own policy note, you've put it in there that we agree to this today. It does increase the eligibility for free school meals, but which are not as expansive as universal provision. Those of us on this committee that voted for universal provision just a few months ago, and indeed this Parliament which agreed to universal provision, will find it difficult to agree to this today because of that inclusion in your own policy note.
But the Parliament also voted for a budget, Mr Ross, that committed the government to delivering on free school meal expansion for those in receipt of Scottish Child Payment. The regulation today allows us to move at pace on that commitment as delivered in the budget. I recognise your party didn't vote for that.
Not to your own commitment of universal free school meals.
But Mr Ross,
sorry, Cabinet Secretary, you made that pledge in the election in 2021. You then were defeated in this Parliament on the 10th of September last year, and now you're asking this committee, and then when it comes to the chamber, this Parliament, to agree to something that I think allows you to deliver less. We've got the Children's Commissioner giving evidence after you, and she's sat behind you. She said at the time that the rollback on universal free school meals was a broken promise to children. She said that children going to school hungry could severely impact development in childhood and into adulthood. And then her final quote was, "One of the greatest barriers to the take-up of free school meals are feelings of shame and stigma, and only providing meals to primary 6 and 7 in receipt of the Scottish Child Payment just exacerbates that stigma." Do you agree with that? And therefore, do you agree that the Children's Commissioner sounds like she doesn't support this regulation?
Well, it's not my job as Cabinet Secretary to comment on the views of the Children's Commissioner. You'll hear from her shortly. But I do suggest, Mr Ross, that the Parliament voted for a budget which commits the Government to deliver on free school meal expansion for those in receipt of the Scottish Child Payment. You and your party voted against that. But this regulation,
but
this
you
SSI
and your
today
party
actually,
voted against a
sorry,
motion.
Mr Ross,
sorry,
you
Cabinet
Secretary.
Your
question.
Well,
you're talking across me.
Well, Cabinet Secretary, just because you're repeating a point you've already... Cabinet Secretary, you're repeating a point you've already made. But do you respect the will of Parliament on the 10th of September last year, which was to provide universal free school meals? Regardless of what was in the budget earlier this year, there was a vote and a determination in this Parliament to provide universal free school meals, and this regulation will allow you not to implement that, despite all the concerns, both politically and, as I've just articulated, from the Children's Commissioner.
I don't agree with that assertion, Convener. And actually, of course, the commitment to deliver on the free school meal expansion in relation to targeting via the Scottish Child Payment was agreed to in advance of the next stage of the universal rollout. So this, to your original point, does not preclude the government from our ultimate aspiration, which is to deliver on universality. And if anything, this compels the government to deliver on the delivery.
So if it compels you, when will you deliver it?
Excuse me?
And you've just said it compels you to deliver it. So when will you deliver universal free school meals? I'm just taking your words. You've just said this regulation, that's now convincing me, so well done. If this regulation compels you to deliver universal free school meals, when will you do it?
Mr Ross, the budget as negotiated agrees, well, essentially commits the government to delivery of free school meals for children in receipt of the Scottish Child Payment in Primary 6 and Primary 7. It also commits us to further work in relation to the Test of Change project in S1 and S3. You and your party voted against the budget. Today I am bringing forward regulations which essentially allow us to deliver on the budget that was passed by Parliament. You're suggesting we are not listening in government to the will of Parliament. I am advancing the will of Parliament in that regard. However, I accept the point in relation to universal free school meals. The financial challenge the government faces is well known to the committee, and I've talked to the budget gap in relation to the £256 million of investment required in relation to universality. That budget line has not been updated for 2 years, so I'm not able to give you a firm date in that regard in relation to universality today, but I will continue to work across the chamber on the delivery of universality, because I think it's so important. And we talk about child poverty and some of the impacts that have been borne by our children in our schools. I hope Mr Ross can also reflect on the impacts of austerity in terms of how our children and their educational attainment has been impacted in recent years. Some of the impacts on our budget as a government have been taken by decisions from governments elsewhere, including those by his party. So I don't think there is disagreement today in relation to...
There's big disagreement, Cabinet Secretary. I've let you make your points, but there is big disagreement.
You've repeatedly interrupted me.
Well, I didn't interrupt you there. You got to say all the points you wanted to make. Can you not just tell us when you will deliver universal free school meals? If you say this regulation takes you forward towards that aim, tell us when.
Convener, as I have set out to you, the modelling the government last undertook in this is 2 years old.
But that's on the government then. You could have done that in the last couple of years. Could
Are
you
you
not?
going to allow me to answer
yes,
your
please.
question?
Can you tell me, in the last couple of years, could you have done new modelling on the cost of free school meals and the universal
modelling
provision?
I have is 2 years old. It puts the estimated cost at £256 million. I am more than happy to engage with political parties on how we get to the delivery of universality, but Parliament well knows, and we have discussed and debated at length, it is not going to be in this parliamentary term because of the costs associated with that rollout. However, we have taken a decision as a government to work on a cross-party basis on the deliverability of that rollout for children in receipt of the Scottish Child Payment. The SSI today allows us to move forward at pace on that. It will also allow more families to obtain access to free school meals provision, which I think is a good thing for families in Scotland and for children as well.
So you've just said that the government haven't looked at this figure for 2 years. It's 2 years out of date. Are you then saying, while trying to pretend that you respect the will of Parliament, after the vote on the 10th of September last year, when your government was defeated and there was an agreement by Parliament to introduce universal free school meals, you did no work at all on how much that would cost?
Yeah. So, of course, we consider these costs constantly. And actually, following that debate, I engaged directly with the Scottish Futures Trust on this, particularly on the 256 figure that was put to us by the Scottish Futures Trust. And I should say that was independently analysed. And Mr Ross's colleague, Mr Kerr, I think at the time, when he was education spokesperson, put forward in a Conservative, I think it may have been actually in your motion, a different figure, which we differed on because it didn't include, as I understand it, capital costs. But I'm in constant contact with the SFT on driving those costs down, and I'm more than happy to consider other suggestions. Mr Kerr actually came forward with a suggestion. I don't think that was borne out by the facts in relation to the fact that the government, of course, their expansive provision and the funding associated with that have had to spend millions of pounds in capital building kitchens, which, of course, has increased the cost, and those were not accounted for example, in the Conservative costs. But let's go back to budget negotiations. If this was such a pressing issue for Mr Ross and his party, why was universality of free school meals not put forward as a budget negotiation, for example, with our party at the time? I don't recall it being.
Very
Other
easy.
parties,
Sorry,
well,
Secretary,
no,
very easy
Convener,
to
you've spoken over me this morning at length, and you're now not allowing me to answer the questions you've put to me.
Well, you've just put a question to me, and I'm happy to
answer
it.
I'll sit very quietly and allow you to interrupt me and interject consistently. I think it's particularly not particularly pleasant, but I will allow you to continue, Mr Ross.
Well, that's very magnanimous of you. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. You asked why was it not included. potentially because Parliament had already agreed. The will of Parliament was clear on the 10th of September 2024 when your government was defeated.
The will of Parliament also backed a budget, which is to deliver on Scottish child payment provision, and that's what I'm here today to do. You can't pick and choose, Mr Ross.
Well,
and on universality, we remain committed to the rollout of universality in preschool meals.
It sounds like you're picking and choosing, Cabinet Secretary, but just go back to your point. Can you then clarify, because you've given a number of different timeframes, is it 2 years since you've looked at the figures, and that's why you can't give us more accurate information, or did you get figures before or just after the debate on the 10th of September last year? Because you've given 2 answers on that.
No, the analysis we were provided with by the SFT was from 18 months ago, and I have met with the SFT and engaged with them further to that time. I am not aware that they've given us a further update to that 18-month timescale because we're not going to be able to deliver it during this parliamentary session. What we have been able to do through the budget negotiations, though, is to identify the additional funding required to deliver on the SCP in P6 and P7 and on the other asks of other parties around about the rollout of free school meals in secondary schools in terms of the S1 to S3 requirements, and I think that's really important.
So when your government was defeated on the 10th of September, you did not go away and ask for updated figures? I
did engage with the SFT on that.
So are the figures you're using from 2 years ago or from September last year? That's all I'm trying to get from you.
The figures that we've been presented with by the SFT are from 18 months ago, the 256 figure.
So what did you get in September last year when you asked them?
Wait, Alison, do you want to come?
Yeah. Well, can you not tell us, Cabinet Secretary?
Well, we engaged with the SFT directly on these points and asked them again to consider the figure. My expectation on my engagement with the SFT last year, Mr Ross, is that if anything, the 256 figure has increased because of inflationary pressures. That was the discussion I had with them at the time.
So you have a more recent figure than one from 2 years ago?
They've not carried out, I don't think, further modelling work on that because, of course, it won't be possible to deliver that during this parliamentary session, no.
Even though Parliament agreed to it last year?
Parliament did agree to it. Parliament also agreed to a budget. It's not going to be deliverable by the end of this parliamentary session, Mr Ross. I think you know that.
Well, we don't know because you don't have up-to-date costs. Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary and officials, and thank you for joining us. I think there's no doubt that people watching today will be disappointed that the government came into office in 2021 and offered on the manifesto promise of free school meals from primary 1s to primary 7, and committee are being asked today to accept the fact the government have failed to meet that commitment and that instead to give a second best option, I think. Would the Cabinet Secretary agree with that?
Yes, I would agree with that, and I share that disappointment.
And can I ask then, just to check, does the Cabinet Secretary think that will be delivered, that free school meals for primary 1s to 7 will be delivered in this parliamentary session?
It's my expectation that working with local authorities, it will be delivered during this parliamentary session, yes. That is my expectation and understanding. And I think, based on discussions with officials, we expect the vast majority of these projects to be delivered actually by the end, hopefully, of this calendar year. There are some that are more complex because, to the point I think I was trying to make to Mr Ross, some require more extensive building works, for example, than others. We made in the budget last year provision for capital, the capital element, and this year we've made provision available in terms of resource. So the funding's been made available. We've also put forward the regulatory updates, and that's what today's SSI about. So we're enabling local authorities to get on with and deliver on the expectations of the Parliament, particularly in relation to the budget agreement.
But not on the universality for primary 1s to primary 7?
But the budget requirement, the budget agreement does not provide for that.
And does the Cabinet Secretary think that the budget agreement will, in this Parliament, at some point, provide for the delivery of free school meals to primary 1 to primary 7?
For universality, sorry, or for...
Yes.
No, because that's not what the budget requirement has delivered. The budget requirement has delivered the rollout for SCP in P6 and P7 and for the Test of Change project in S1 Test 3.
OK, so the government is not going to deliver free school meals to all primary 1s to primary 7s within this parliamentary session?
I think that's been confirmed to the parliamentary chamber many months ago now.
OK, despite manifesto commitments, despite expectations and despite the parliamentary vote?
The budget, as voted for by the Parliament, commits us to the rollout of Primary 6 and Primary 7 Scottish Child Payment and those in S1 Test 3 and the Test of Change programme. It does not commit to universality. Ms Duncan-Glancy knows that. We've discussed this at length in the Chamber.
I accept that, but with respect, Cabinet Secretary, it was the government who proposed that budget.
Yes, it tends to be the government that proposes the budget.
Yes, and that budget did not propose funding to do what the government said it would do.
the budget proposes funding to fund rollout targeted to the Scottish Child Payment. That was also in the programme for government, I think, last September. I think in terms of our commitment as a government, we've been pretty clear on this, and that's been discussed at length in the Chamber additionally.
So why hasn't the government decided to continue with its original aim of free school meals for all primary 1s to 7?
I, again, have discussed this at length in the Chamber. It's unaffordable. So the budget gap, as last assessed in the 18-month ago figure from the Scottish Futures Trust, although that has been internally assessed with the SFT and we have pushed them further in relation to that figure, is unaffordable in the remainder of this parliamentary session.
Does the Cabinet Secretary accept that the budget settlement from the UK budget has been the largest settlement for the Scottish Government since devolution, and so people watching will be wondering, if not now, in that circumstance, when?
So if the budget settlement from the United Kingdom Government was so generous, I am at a bit of a loss to understand as to why Ms Duncan Glancy and her party abstained on the budget, because of course the budget commits the government, as does this SSI, to moving forward and doing more. And I gave the example of Edinburgh City Council, which is just one local authority area, in terms of the thousands of families that we expect will benefit from this SSI. It commits the government to moving on the budget as negotiated and voted for by the Parliament. So I think it commits us to progress. I could sit back and allow local authorities to use their own data sharing measurements that they currently do. But we know that doesn't capture most families in receipt of the Scottish Child Payment. So this approach, this SSI, ensures that local authorities have the data they need to deliver on the funding we've provided through the budget in relation to the Scottish Child Payment. But I think the overall point from Ms Duncan Glancy in terms of universality, I would agree with. She well knows the inflationary pressures that the government was forced to contend with in 2021 that have made everything much more expensive. So building kitchens, for example, is now much more expensive than it was 3 years ago. There have been other costs that we've had to meet, not least in terms of pay deals, and that has affected the budget I've had to manage and what we've been able to pay for. So it is with deep regret, from my own personal perspective as Cabinet Secretary, that we have not been able to deliver on universality. It remains an aspiration and a commitment of this government. I am pleased we're making progress in relation to the Scottish Child Payment rollout, and this SSI is the next step of our commitment to that universal rollout, and the government stands by that.
Okay.